Have you ever stumbled upon a secret that seemed like just a whisper in the dark, until the deeper you dug, the more terrifyingly real it became? This wasn't just a murder. This was a truth buried beneath years of silence, a secret the village had always hidden. But now, that silence was breaking. Someone wanted the truth to stay buried forever, and someone was determined to drag it into the light. The real question was, once the truth was uncovered, would anyone be ready to face it? The thick morning mist curled around the ancient hedges of Rosewood Manor as Mr. Blackwood, the aged gardener who had tended the grounds for over 2 decades, drove his shovel into the damp earth. But something was wrong. The soil beneath gave way too easily, unnaturally soft for this time of year. His breath hitched as the metal edge of his tool scraped against something beneath the overgrown shrubbery, a dull, hollow sound that sent a chill down his spine. With hesitant hands, he brushed away the tangled roots and damp leaves, revealing a rusted iron handle embedded in the ground. The moment he pressed down, the earth groaned in protest, the wooden boards beneath shifting just enough to reveal a hidden entrance. He didn't want to look. A part of him screamed to turn away, to pretend he hadn't seen what lay beneath. But curiosity, or perhaps dread, won. As the hatch creaked open, the scent of decaying wood and something more pungent, something unmistakably human, filled his nostrils, and then he saw it. A body, twisted awkwardly on the floor below, limbs sprawled unnaturally. The face, oh that face, was contorted into a grotesque grimace, bloodshot eyes frozen in an expression of agony. A thick rope remained looped around the throat, the deep bruises speaking of a violent end. The dirt around the corpse was freshly disturbed, yet something about the rigid stillness of the features suggested the man had been dead longer than a few hours. Mr. Blackwood swallowed hard, his hand instinctively wiping at his mouth as a bitter taste coated his tongue. Death was no stranger to Rosewood Manor, not the kind that sparked rumors in taverns, but the kind that was quietly buried beneath years of secrecy. His hands trembled as he stepped back. No one had seen him make the discovery, no one but the shadows clinging to the trees. But keeping this silent was out of the question. Straightening his back, he forced himself to move, his voice cutting through the still morning air as he called for help. The echo of his own voice seemed to mock him, carrying through the mist and up to the looming house beyond. 30 minutes later, Inspector Phelps arrived, his broad figure emerging from the fog, his coat hanging loose over his frame, as if it had grown too large for him overnight. He had the expression of a man who had seen too much but still approached his work with a quiet, deliberate intensity. His eyes flicked to the disturbed ground, then to the gaping hole in the earth. Behind him, Sergeant Doyle ambled closer, hands shoved in his pockets, his gaze landing on the corpse with the same detachment one might afford a misplaced set of keys. "Robbery," Doyle muttered, tilting his head. "Looks like someone got caught where they shouldn't have." Phelps let out a slow breath, kneeling at the entrance to the hidden tunnel, his fingers tracing the damp wooden boards. "A robbery," he echoed, skepticism lacing his words. And yet, his shoes remain untouched, his watch still on his wrist. He stood, dusting off his coat. "Tell me, Doyle, what sort of thief strangles a man and leaves behind everything valuable?" Doyle merely shrugged, shifting uncomfortably as he glanced toward the manor's towering silhouette in the distance. Could be a drifter, could be something worse. Phelps didn't answer. He already knew this was no simple crime, and the note, yes, the note, tucked carefully between the folds of the victim's coat, told him that whoever had done this wanted it to be found. "Get the body moved, interview the staff. Someone in that house knows more than they're saying," Phelps instructed, his gaze lingering on the darkened windows of the manor. "And Doyle, keep your ears open, something about this doesn't smell right." Meanwhile, in the village of St. Mary Mead, the news traveled faster than the morning chill, carried by the ever-watchful Mrs. Price, who wasted no time in spreading whispers through the town. In her cozy sitting room, Miss Marple sipped her tea as she listened, not interrupting, merely absorbing every detail. "They found a body, you know," Mrs. Price rattled on, her words tumbling over each other. Right there in the gardens of Rosewood Manor, and the Harringtons, oh, you wouldn't believe the state they're in. I dare say the whispers have already started. Not the first time something dreadful has happened at that house, Jane. Miss Marple simply smiled, her fingers tightening slightly around her cup. She didn't need to ask questions. People had a way of ensuring she heard everything she needed to, and what she heard now told her that something was very, very wrong. The Harringtons had always balanced delicately between old-world wealth and something much more sinister. The manor, with its imposing grandeur, held more secrets than its ivy-covered walls could contain. And secrets, Miss Marple knew, had a way of surfacing when least expected. Setting her cup down, she rose, smoothing her knitted cardigan. A visit to her dear friend, Mrs. Harrington, was in order, under the pretense of offering comfort, of course. But comfort was never the real reason Miss Marple called. No, she needed to see the house, to feel its tension, to observe the cracks in the facade. As she approached the grand iron gates of Rosewood Manor, they groaned in protest, as if reluctant to let her through. The hedges loomed taller than she remembered, their shadows stretching across the gravel path, like grasping fingers. The house itself, despite its elegance, felt oppressive, suffocating in its desperate attempt to mask the rot within. Inside, Mrs. Harrington sat in the dimly lit drawing room, her fingers clutching a delicate teacup with a grip too tight for comfort. "Oh, Jane, how kind of you to come," she murmured, her voice laced with something more than mere distress. Miss Marple took the seat by the window, her sharp gaze flickering to the garden beyond, the very place where a body had been unearthed just that morning. "Quite unsettling," she said gently, but not entirely unexpected. Mrs. Harrington flinched, her already pale face blanching further, and in that moment, Miss Marple knew that there was more to this murder than anyone was willing to admit. On a cold morning, as the mist wrapped St. Mary Mead in its ghostly embrace, Rosewood Manor's gardener, Mr. Blackwood, went about his usual work. But as his spade struck the earth, he felt something unusual. The soil was softer than it should have been, as if it had been disturbed. A second, harder strike, and the ground gave way, revealing something hidden beneath. A wooden hatch, old and bound with rusted chains, lay buried in the damp soil. His breath caught in his throat as he hesitated, then pulled the hatch open. Darkness yawned beneath, swallowing the weak daylight. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw it. The lifeless body of a man, his throat tightly strangled with a thick rope, his face frozen in an expression of fear and anguish. Yet, there was something even more unsettling. A withered yellowed note clutched in his stiff fingers, bearing a single name, Harrington. Within minutes, Rosewood Manor was abuzz with shock and horror. Inspector Phelps, a man known for his sharp mind and colder demeanor, arrived at the scene, his ever-skeptical Sergeant Doyle trailing behind him. If this were a simple robbery, something would be missing from the man's pockets, Phelps remarked, scanning the lifeless figure. Doyle, standing over the corpse, picked up the note with trembling fingers. "Harrington," his voice wavered. "Isn't that the name of the manor's owner?" Phelps snatched the note and examined it carefully. "This isn't just a name, Doyle. This is a warning." His voice was low, measured, the kind of tone he used when a case was about to unravel into something much more sinister. Rumors spread through the village like wildfire. Some whispered of an old vendetta, others spoke of the manor's long-forgotten secrets. But no one was more intrigued than Miss Jane Marple, whose knitting needles clicked rhythmically as her sharp mind pieced together the puzzle. When Mrs. Price, the village's self-proclaimed source of all gossip, came rushing in, her voice again. "Have you heard? They found a body under the manor, and they say there are hidden tunnels beneath it. Old smugglers' roots." Miss Marple merely smiled, but her eyes gleamed with curiosity. A body, a tunnel, and a name that ties back to the owners of the manor. She set her knitting aside and rose from her chair. "I do believe it's time to pay Mrs. Harrington a visit." When Miss Marple arrived at Rosewood Manor, an air of unease clung to its grand yet decaying walls. Once an imposing structure, the manor now seemed haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of something long buried. In the drawing room, Mrs. Harrington sat stiffly, her porcelain complexion even paler than usual. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as she lifted her teacup, her gaze never quite meeting Miss Marple's. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said, her voice calm but brittle. Miss Marple simply studied her for a moment before offering a placid smile. "Oh, of course not," she replied lightly. "It's just one wonders how long this house has kept its secrets. The tunnels, the hidden doors, one can only imagine what Mr. Blackwood must have felt when he found that poor soul." A tense silence followed. Then the creak of floorboards as the maid entered to refill the tea. Mrs. Harrington's grip on her cup tightened, her lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. Miss Marple noticed it all, the twitch in her eye, the way her fingers drummed against the china, but she was in no rush. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it was buried. Outside, Inspector Phelps and Sergeant Doyle explored the overgrown grounds, their keen eyes searching for more clues. "This isn't just about a single murder," Phelps muttered. "This is about the past clawing its way back to the surface. And I have a feeling this manor has more stories to tell." Doyle exhaled sharply. "So what are you saying, that this is just the beginning?" Phelps turned, his expression grave. "I'm saying, Doyle, that nothing in this house is as it seems." As Miss Marple made her way back through the village's winding streets, she knew one thing for certain: this was no ordinary crime. A body had been unearthed, but so had a story, and in a place like St. Mary Mead, secrets never stayed buried for long. The morning mist clung to the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, curling like ghostly fingers around chimneys and settling into the narrow alleys between the village shops. The weight of unease had not lifted since the grim discovery beneath Rosewood Manor, and though life carried on, shopkeepers raising their shutters, milkmaids making their rounds, there was an unnatural hush beneath it all, a collective breath held in anticipation of something yet to unfold. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly in the quiet of her cottage, glanced up as the door creaked open. Inspector Phelps, his broad-shouldered frame almost too large for the quaint doorway, stood there with a look of reluctant urgency. "Just coming by to see you," he said gruffly. "Oh, how kind of you," Miss Marple replied in her usual mild tone, though she noted the hesitation in his stance, the subtle twitch in his jaw. "I trust everything is going well with the investigation. I'm sure the village is very interested in your findings." Phelps exhaled sharply, considering his words before finally speaking. "We're still waiting on details. The victim was a stranger. No one in the village recognizes him. No identification, nothing except a torn slip of paper with some intriguing writing. Might suggest smuggled goods." Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes flickered with interest. "Ah, how very curious." Phelps shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to the window where villagers passed, their voices hushed with speculation. But Miss Marple didn't press further. She had long learned that Phelps preferred to guard his discoveries until they could no longer be hidden. Instead she inquired lightly, "And Sergeant Doyle, still on the case, I presume?" Phelps's expression darkened. "Yes, though I'm beginning to wonder if he's more interested in keeping things quiet than solving the crime." There was a pause, a moment thick with unspoken tension, before he added, "But we'll manage. We always do." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Of course you will, though one does wonder if the village might know more than it lets on." Phelps gave a tight nod, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You're probably right. I'll let you know if we find anything new." And with that he left, his heavy boots thudding against the cobbled street. The day passed quietly, but beneath the surface, the village churned with whispers. The Harringtons, once the pinnacle of wealth and reputation, found their names slipping into more sinister conversations. Roger Harrington's debts were no secret, but now murmurs of shady investors and illicit dealings spread like wildfire. And then there was Reverend Arthur Davis, the once respected cleric, whose usual air of gentle dignity had begun to crack. It was said that the church's funds had been dwindling, small amounts vanishing without explanation. A coincidence? Miss Marple thought not. But perhaps the most intriguing figure in this tangled affair was Miss Lucy Bradfield, the distant cousin visiting Rosewood Manor. She had arrived only a week before the murder. Yet already, her name was being linked with the dead man. Cold, distant and secretive, Lucy did not fit in with the world of grand parties and polished silver. There was something dangerous about her, or perhaps it was her silence, the kind of silence that suggested she had much to hide. As Miss Marple made her way toward the village square, she caught a hushed conversation between Mrs. Price and the butcher's wife. "Harrington's man, Mr. Blackwood, he's always turned a blind eye, but now, he's all shook up, running about like a headless chicken. Something's not right, you mark my word." Miss Marple's gaze followed the elderly woman as she hurried off, but she didn't linger. People were always quick to talk, especially when they didn't know the full story, and Miss Marple had long learned to listen for what wasn't said. As evening descended, an unnatural stillness settled over St. Maur. Mary Mead, as if the village itself sensed the weight of what lay ahead. Secrets, long buried, were beginning to claw their way to the surface, and soon the truth would demand to be heard. But the question remained: who would be the one to break first? The heavy oak doors of Ashwood Manor creaked open, revealing Eleanor Blackwell, her face ghostly pale, drawn tight with the kind of anxiety that settled in one's bones. Her trembling hands adjusted the lace trim of her sleeve, as if trying to keep herself composed. But Miss Marple knew better. Eleanor was a woman teetering on the edge of a truth. She dared not speak. "Oh, Miss Marple," Eleanor exhaled, her voice brittle, words spilling out in a hurried whisper. "I don't know what to do. Everything that's happened." She trailed off, eyes darting toward the dimly lit corridor behind her, as though afraid something might emerge from the shadows. "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied, stepping inside with a reassuring smile. "I thought I'd call on you. These things, well, they can shake one's very foundation." Her gaze swept across the drawing room, its once grand furnishings now carrying an air of faded opulence. Dust lingered in the creases of velvet drapes, and the scent of lavender failed to mask the underlying mustiness of a house that had been keeping secrets for far too long. Eleanor's fingers twisted together in her lap. "My husband and I, we have been so careful, Miss Marple, so very careful to maintain our reputation." Her voice hitched, and she cast a nervous glance toward the window, as if expecting unseen eyes to peer in. But now she hesitated, swallowing hard. "This dreadful business, I fear it's all unraveling." Miss Marple studied her carefully. The Blackwells had built their lives upon wealth and decorum, yet the cracks in their perfect world were beginning to widen, revealing something far darker beneath. "I imagine your husband is quite troubled," Miss Marple mused, her tone light but precise. "Scandal can be rather difficult to avoid, particularly when one has connections." Eleanor stiffened, her breath catching for just a fraction of a second. Henry is managing, of course," she stammered. "We didn't know the man, the victim. He wasn't one of us." Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable, though her mind was already turning over the implications of those words. A sound echoed from the hall, footsteps, slow and deliberate. A moment later, Henry Blackwell appeared, his presence filling the room like a storm rolling in. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried the kind of effortless authority that came with old money and well-kept secrets. His sharp features were carefully composed, but Miss Marple detected the faintest flicker of tension at the corners of his eyes. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his voice smooth, practiced. "I do hope my wife hasn't troubled you too much. It's been a trying morning." He extended a hand, his grip firm, practiced, but Miss Marple noted how his fingers lingered just a second too long, as if assessing her just as she was assessing him. Appearances must be maintained, after all. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly, though her eyes remained keen. Yes, appearances are everything, aren't they? Especially when one's name is caught in the swirling currents of scandal. Her words were soft, almost casual, yet they landed with precise weight. For the briefest moment, Henry's polished composure faltered, but he recovered quickly. He gestured toward the chairs by the fireplace. "I'm sure you'll want to hear the details. The police are still investigating, though there's little to go on, other than the unfortunate discovery of a stranger in our midst." Miss Marple settled into her seat, knitting needles clicking as she considered his words. "Yes," she murmured, eyes glinting with quiet certainty. "A stranger, found in your garden, how very peculiar indeed." The silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Secrets never remained buried for long, Miss Marple knew. Not in a village like this. Inspector Caldwell leaned forward, his gaze sharp as he studied Evelyn Montclair, the lady of Ashford Manor. She sat stiffly in the high-backed armchair, her fingers curled tightly around the delicate embroidery of her silk handkerchief. The drawing-room, despite its grand chandelier and aged mahogany furnishings, carried the unmistakable chill of a house unsettled by tragedy. Outside, the rain pattered softly against the windows, an unrelenting whisper against the silence stretching between them. "It's troubling, isn't it?" Caldwell's voice was smooth, deceptively calm. "A man found dead on your estate, and no one seems to know who he is." Evelyn's breath hitched, just slightly, before she forced a brittle smile. "Quite troubling," she agreed, though her voice wavered. "My husband Andrew and I, we were utterly blindsided. We don't entertain strangers, Inspector. We certainly wouldn't have allowed a vagrant to wander our grounds." Caldwell tilted his head, watching her carefully. "And yet he wasn't a vagrant, was he?" Evelyn stiffened. Across the room Andrew Montclair stood near the fireplace, his tall frame cast in flickering amber light. He had been silent thus far, his expression carved from stone. Now he shifted ever so slightly, his jaw tightening. "What exactly are you suggesting, Inspector?" he asked, his tone even, but edged with something colder. "Only that strangers don't simply appear in gardens without reason," Caldwell replied. "Someone somewhere must have known him, perhaps even someone in this house." Evelyn's grip on the handkerchief tightened, her knuckles whitening. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, as though the house itself held its breath, waiting for someone to break. "It's absurd," Andrew cut in before she could respond. "We have no connection to this man. If we did, don't you think we would have reported it?" "People report things when they feel safe to do so, Mr. Montclair," Caldwell mused, his tone mild. "Not when they have something to protect." A single charged beat of silence passed before Evelyn rose to her feet, as if the act of standing might somehow lend her strength. "Inspector, surely you don't think we had anything to do with this?" "I think," Caldwell said, leaning back slightly, "that there are things in this house no one is saying, things that would explain how a man ends up dead in your garden, completely unnoticed until morning." Evelyn's gaze flickered toward her husband, her face pale, lips pressed together, as though to keep something from spilling out. Andrew, meanwhile, had adopted an expression of practiced indifference, but Caldwell had seen enough men like him to know a mask when he saw one. There were fractures beneath the polished surface, and fractures had a way of deepening under pressure. Caldwell stood, adjusting his coat. "I'll take my leave for now," he said, "but I trust you'll let me know if anything comes to mind." He let his words linger as he turned toward the door, pausing just briefly to glance back. "Because you see, the truth has a rather persistent way of coming to light, especially when people think they've buried it." And with that, he stepped into the cold night, the manor's shadows seeming to watch him go. Somewhere within its walls, a secret lay waiting, and Caldwell had every intention of unearthing it. The golden glow of the candelabra cast long, shifting shadows along the panelled walls of Blackwood Hall's drawing room. The air was thick, perfumed with aged wood and something more elusive, tension, carefully hidden behind polite decorum. Inspector Alden, tall and methodical, took his time studying the room, his sharp gaze moving from the heavy velvet drapes to the high-backed chairs that framed the cold, grand fireplace. Across from him, Eleanor Whitmore sat still as a portrait, her fingers entwined in a lace handkerchief, twisting and untwisting the fabric in silent distress. The only sign of life in her otherwise carefully composed figure. Standing near the fireplace, Henry Whitmore watched Alden with a gaze that was unreadable but held something just beneath the surface, calculation, perhaps even irritation. His tailored vest sat snugly over his broad chest, his stance easy but deliberate, a man accustomed to power and expectation. The crackling silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, waiting to snap. A fascinating thing, Alden mused, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, a tunnel beneath the manor. You'd think the family would know about something like that. Eleanor's hands jerked ever so slightly, and Henry exhaled through his nose, a sound almost like amusement but too controlled to be genuine. Blackwood Hall is an old house, Inspector, Henry said, reaching for the crystal decanter resting on the mahogany sideboard. The liquid glowed amber in the dim light as he poured himself a drink. Old houses have their secrets. It doesn't mean those secrets are worth investigating. Alden tilted his head, considering him. Perhaps he allowed his tone neutral, but it's curious timing, wouldn't you agree? A hidden passage, its entrance disturbed just days before a man unidentified, no less, turns up dead on your estate. Eleanor inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening on the lace between them. The candlelight flickered against the polished surface of the oak table, catching the tension that danced invisibly between them. Henry lifted his glass, but there was the briefest pause before he took a sip, the kind of hesitation Alden had learned to look for. It was never in the words, it was in the silences, the moments between what was spoken. My groundskeeper, Mr. Graham, Alden continued, taking a slow step forward, tells me the tunnel wasn't just an old passageway. He found signs of recent reinforcement, fresh brickwork, a hidden doorway sealed and then reopened. He paused deliberately. That's a rather modern touch for something so ancient, don't you think? Henry chuckled, but the sound rang hollow. You're suggesting what exactly, Inspector? That Eleanor and I spend our evenings crawling through hidden corridors, burying strangers beneath the floorboards. Eleanor flinched, just barely, and Alden's gaze snapped to her. She lowered her eyes, her lips parting slightly, as if she might say something, but then just as quickly, she pressed them together in silence. I'm suggesting, Alden said, his voice smooth, deliberate, that someone knew about that tunnel, and someone used it. He let the words hang in the charged air, watching their effect. Henry's fingers tightened around the glass, and Eleanor's gaze flickered, not toward her husband, nor the inspector, but toward the farthest wall, where an old tapestry hung heavily against the stone. Alden followed her glance, the corners of his mouth curving just slightly. How peculiar, he murmured. I've been in this room several times, but I don't recall that tapestry being quite so drawn. Henry stiffened, the movement almost imperceptible, but Alden caught it. Eleanor, silent and pale, merely clasped her hands tighter in her lap. The wind outside howled against the stained glass windows, rattling the panes as if the very bones of the house were whispering their displeasure. A clock in the hallway struck the hour, its chimes echoing through the vast manor, each tolling note, thickening the suspense that coiled around them. Then, as if fate itself had chosen the moment, a knock rapped against the heavy oak doors of the drawing room. A servant entered, bowing slightly before stepping aside to reveal a new figure, Miss Charlotte Dunley, Eleanor's cousin, dressed in mourning black though no one had yet been buried. Her sharp, keen eyes swept the room as she stepped inside, her lace-gloved fingers twitching at her sides. I do hope I'm not interrupting, she said, her voice quiet yet firm, her gaze lingering on Eleanor for a fraction too long. Alden merely smiled. Not at all, he said. In fact, I suspect you've arrived at precisely the right moment. The room held its breath. Because secrets, Alden knew, had a way of surfacing when one least expected, and some secrets were never meant to stay buried. The heavy air in the drawing room of Ashbourne Manor seemed to press down on its occupants like an invisible weight. The chandelier's dim glow flickered against the polished walnut bookshelves, casting restless shadows that stretched and shrank with each tremor of the candlelight. Eleanor Montclair sat rigidly upon the high-backed chair near the window, her gloved hands tightening around the edge of her shawl, her knuckles pale. Across from her, Inspector Lucian Graves studied her with the quiet patience of a man who had spent his life unearthing the lies people so desperately wished to keep buried. The scent of aging books and faintly lingering cigar smoke filled the room, blending with the charged stillness that thickened with every passing second. A cold draught whispered through the room, stirring the lace curtains and sending an involuntary shiver down Eleanor's spine. Her gaze flickered to the door, just once, fleeting but telling. Graves caught it, his sharp eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The mind does curious things under stress, does it not, Mrs. Montclair? He murmured, his voice smooth, deliberate. It clings to details it should not, and ignores those it should remember. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, as if forming a reply, but no words came. Instead, it was her husband, Samuel Montclair, who spoke, stepping forward with a carefully composed expression that did little to mask the storm brewing beneath his polished exterior. "Inspector," he said, smoothing down the front of his waistcoat with slow, practiced ease, "I'm afraid you're chasing ghosts. My wife has endured an unspeakable ordeal. A man found murdered on our estate, a complete stranger no less. The very notion that she could provide any insight into this unfortunate matter is not as absurd as you'd like me to believe," Graves interrupted smoothly, his gaze now locked onto Samuel's with quiet intensity. "You see, Mr. Montclair, I find it rather intriguing that despite this stranger being, as you put it, unknown to you, your staff recalls seeing him near the estate on more than one occasion. A man who seemed to know precisely where he was going, as if he had been here before." A muscle twitched in Samuel's jaw, a fraction of a second too late to be mistaken for anything but restrained tension. "Coincidence, I imagine," he said lightly, though his grip on the arm of the chair was noticeably tight. "Coincidences are such convenient things, aren't they?" Graves mused, leaning back ever so slightly, his tone conversational, almost pleasant, yet carrying the unmistakable sharpness of a blade sliding from its sheath. "And yet I find they rarely exist in matters such as these." The silence stretched taut and fragile. Eleanor exhaled, a breath too measured to be natural, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked, soft, steady, an unnerving reminder of time slipping away, and then, as if on cue, there came a knock at the door, slow, deliberate. A presence waiting beyond the threshold. Samuel hesitated for the briefest of moments before stepping forward and pulling it open. A young woman stood there, her face pale, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her skirt. Lydia Harrington, Eleanor's cousin, recently arrived, her expression one of quiet dread, as though she had stumbled upon something she wished she hadn't. I hope I'm not intruding," she murmured, eyes darting between the occupants of the room. Graves merely smiled, a knowing, expectant smile. "Not at all," he said softly, watching her with the keen interest of a man who had just been handed the final piece of a puzzle. "In fact, I do believe you've arrived precisely when you were meant to." And as the wind outside howled against the manor's grand facade, rattling the window panes like ghostly fingers seeking entry, the truth, heavy, inevitable, pressed closer, just waiting to be unearthed. Rosewood Manor stood in eerie silence, its grand corridors steeped in a history that now felt more oppressive than majestic. Olivia Harrington, seated stiffly on the antique settee, clutched her hands together, her knuckles white with tension. Across from her, Miss Eleanor Merton, the ever-watchful guest, observed with an expression too neutral to be genuine. The room smelled of aged wood, and the faint metallic tang of something less pleasant, a scent that had lingered since the body was discovered. "We don't know him," Olivia murmured, her voice strained as if forcing the words out would make them true. "He wasn't supposed to be here," but Miss Merton merely tilted her head, a slow, deliberate motion, eyes never leaving Olivia's trembling fingers. "And yet," she said, voice smooth as silk, "here he was." The silence that followed was suffocating. Roger Harrington entered then, his presence bringing no relief, only a new layer of tension. His suit was impeccable, yet his collar was slightly damp, a thin sheen of sweat betraying the pressure beneath his composed exterior. "This is all rather unnecessary," he said, his words clipped, his eyes darting toward Olivia as though willing her to say no more. "The police have already questioned us, and there's nothing more to discuss." But Miss Merton leaned back, fingers tracing the delicate embroidery of the chair's armrest. "A dead man in your garden, Mr. Harrington, is hardly nothing." A flicker of something, anger, or perhaps fear, crossed Roger's face before he could suppress it. The air in the room thickened, as if the walls themselves were listening, absorbing the weight of unspoken secrets. Then came the knock. Sharp, precise. The butler hesitated before stepping aside to allow a pale, hesitant figure into the room. Lucy Bradfield, Olivia's cousin, young and too delicate for the weight she carried, stepped inside, eyes flickering over the faces in the room before settling on the floor. In her hand, a lace handkerchief twisted between her fingers, the edges damp. I didn't mean to intrude," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. I wanted to see if everything was all right." Olivia's smile was brittle, forced. "Of course, dear, everything is fine." But Miss Merton saw the way Lucy's gaze lingered too long on the rug, the way her shoes, though clean, held a faint line of dust around the edges, a detail only noticeable to someone accustomed to looking for what others missed. "You weren't out last night, were you, Miss Bradfield?" Miss Merton's question was casual, but its weight was unmistakable. Lucy flinched, just slightly, before shaking her head too quickly. No, I was in my room." A pause. Too long, too deliberate. Miss Merton smiled, a slow knowing smile. "Of course." But her eyes drifted past Lucy, toward the grand fireplace, where above it hung a portrait of the Harrington ancestors. Their stern painted faces watched over the room, witnesses to generations of whispered secrets. And in the background of that oil masterpiece, almost invisible, but there was the faint outline of a ledger, tucked into a shelf. A detail lost in the brushstrokes, but unmistakable to those who knew where to look. Business dealings, family dealings, the kind people preferred to leave buried, just like the truth. Miss Merton let the moment settle, tucking away her observations for later. This was no ordinary crime of circumstance, this was something deeper, older. And if she had learned anything from years of watching families like the Harringtons, it was that the past never stayed buried forever. The heavy rain drummed against the roof of Blackthorn Grange, a relentless rhythm that seemed to echo the unease settling within its ancient walls. Inspector Graves stood at the threshold of the drawing room, his coat still damp from the downpour outside, his sharp gaze sweeping over the assembled guests. There was tension in the air, thick and suffocating, the kind that lingered in places where secrets festered. Across from him, Lady Eleanor Winfield sat poised in her high-backed chair, her hands resting lightly on the velvet armrests, her expression composed yet betraying a flicker of apprehension. Beside her, Thomas Winfield, her son, shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping absently against his knee. And then there was Margaret Vale, the housekeeper. But more than that, she stood near the fireplace, eyes cast downward, her lips pressed tightly together as if guarding words she dared not speak. "You understand why I'm here," Graves began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. A man was found this morning just beyond the garden hedge. The room seemed to inhale, holding its breath. Lady Winfield arched an eyebrow. A vagrant was he? A tragedy, of course. But what does it have to do with us? Graves took a slow step forward, his boots scuffing against the Persian rug. He wasn't a vagrant. He was well dressed, though his pockets had been emptied. And there was something else, a torn slip of paper, damp from the rain, but the ink still legible. He withdrew it from his coat and unfolded it with deliberate care. Cargo manifest, a shipment listed with no destination. Thomas stiffened. And you think that involves us? Graves tilted his head, studying the younger man's reaction. I think it involves someone in this house. I think this man knew something he wasn't supposed to. His gaze flickered to Margaret, whose hands twitched ever so slightly. And I think someone wanted to make sure he never spoke of it. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, casting shifting shadows on the stone walls. This is preposterous, Lady Winfield finally said, though her voice was just a touch too smooth, her confidence just a little too rehearsed. You have no proof. Graves allowed a slow smile. That's the thing about proof, Lady Winfield. It has a way of revealing itself when you least expect it. Outside the storm raged on, but inside, the real tempest was just beginning. Inspector Graves sat hunched over his desk in the dim glow of Blackwood Precinct, the weak light of the desk lamp casting long shadows across scattered reports and half-smoked cigarettes. The murder of an unidentified man in the abandoned railway yard had stirred something in him, a deep, nagging certainty that this wasn't just another case of bad luck. The town was too quiet, too careful, as if everyone was waiting for the dust to settle before they whispered the truth. Across the room, Detective Finch leaned lazily against the filing cabinet, thumbing through an old case file with disinterest. Could be just another vagrant, he muttered, his tone void of concern. But Graves wasn't convinced. The scene had been too meticulous, too deliberate. The victim's hands were clasped, almost reverently, as if in prayer. The torn scrap of parchment found between his stiff fingers was the only clue, a hastily scrawled note, its ink smudged but the message clear. Shipment arrives at midnight. No mistakes this time. Graves tapped his fingers against the wooden desk, staring at the words as if sheer willpower could force them to reveal their secrets. The lack of identification bothered him. No wallet, no papers, nothing to say who the man was or why he had been left out in the cold to die. It was too clean, too perfect. You don't find it odd? Graves finally asked, his voice low and edged with something unreadable. Finch exhaled slowly, shifting his weight. Odd, sure, but people get themselves into trouble all the time. Maybe he was just unlucky. Graves let out a sharp breath, irritation creeping into his usually controlled demeanor. No, this wasn't random. He knew something, and someone made damn sure he never spoke. He glanced back at the note. Midnight. What shipment, and why kill over it? His mind sifted through the whispers that had been circling the town for months. Talk of missing cargo, of crates that vanished before reaching the docks. Smugglers, maybe. Or something worse. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Both men turned, their gazes locking for a brief moment before Graves called out. Come in. The door creaked open, revealing a familiar figure standing in the dim hallway. Margaret, the housekeeper from Blackwood Manor. A quiet woman, always watching, always listening. Tonight she looked different. Her face was drawn, eyes shadowed by something unspoken. She stepped inside hesitantly, her gloved hands clutching the folds of her coat as if bracing against an unseen force. Inspector, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I know who the dead man is, but I need you to promise that if I tell you, you'll protect me. Graves straightened, his sharp gaze fixing on her. Margaret, he said, his voice even but laced with curiosity, you have my word. She hesitated, glancing once over her shoulder, as if someone might be listening from the shadows. Then, in a voice so quiet, it was almost swallowed by the stillness, she whispered, "His name was Samuel Greaves, and he was murdered because he knew what's hidden beneath Blackwood Manor." A cold hush fell over the room. Finch, who had been slouched moments ago, suddenly straightened, his fingers tightening around the edge of the cabinet. Graves felt the slow, steady pound of his own heartbeat, the weight of something far greater than just a murder pressing into his chest. The town of Blackwood had secrets, deep buried ones, and if Samuel Greaves had been killed for knowing too much, then the real question wasn't who had murdered him. It was who else knew the truth, and how far they'd go to keep it hidden. The evening air in Ravenswood carried a damp chill, the kind that settled deep into the bones and made even the bravest souls uneasy. Inspector Hale paced the small confines of his study, the glow of his desk lamp flickering against the stacks of case files that lay before him. His latest case had spiraled into something far more tangled than he had anticipated. The body found at the docks, the mysterious note scrawled with the words, "No more mistakes," midnight shipment, and the unnerving silence from those who should have been desperate to talk. Across from him, perched in the well-worn armchair, as if she belonged to the very shadows of the room, sat Eleanor Finch, an older woman, with a mind sharper than any blade Hale had ever known. She stirred her tea methodically, watching him with knowing eyes. "You're unsettled," she observed, her voice calm yet laced with something Hale couldn't quite place. "That's unlike you." Hale exhaled, rubbing his temples as he slumped into his chair. "This case doesn't sit right, Eleanor. It's too neat, too convenient." He glanced at the torn slip of paper once more, as if expecting it to rewrite itself with clearer answers. The body was staged, the evidence too sparse, and the people who should be worried. "They're not talking. That tells me they're either too scared or too involved." Eleanor hummed thoughtfully, setting down her tea with a delicate clink. "And which do you suspect?" Hale hesitated. The Harrington family had been whispering about their missing accountant, but when questioned, they had dodged with rehearsed nonchalance. Then there was Doyle, the dock foreman, who had barely blinked when shown the dead man's photograph. He had simply smirked and muttered, "Strange things happen by the water, Inspector." Hale's gut twisted at the memory. He knew when someone was lying. "I think it's both," he admitted. "Someone is covering for someone else. And if I don't figure out who soon, we'll have another body before the week is over." Eleanor gave a small, almost amused smile, knitting her fingers together in her lap. "People are like chess pieces, Inspector. Some move with purpose, others are moved without ever realizing it." She studied him for a long moment before adding, "I suspect you're dealing with both." A sharp rap at the door cut through the quiet tension. Hale straightened, shooting Eleanor a glance before calling, "Come in." The door creaked open, revealing Margaret Harrow, the housekeeper from the estate near the docks. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of her coat. "Inspector," she breathed, stepping inside as if she feared something would follow her. "I shouldn't be here, but I can't keep quiet anymore." Hale's pulse quickened. He gestured for her to sit. "Tell me what you know, Margaret." She hesitated, wringing her hands. "The man you found, he wasn't just some stranger. His name was Samuel Reed, and he was murdered because he knew the truth about what's hidden beneath the Harrington estate." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Hale felt Eleanor's gaze flicker toward him, a silent confirmation of what she had suspected all along. "And what exactly is hidden there?" he asked, his voice steady, despite the unease creeping into his bones. Margaret swallowed hard. "Something that should have stayed buried." Eleanor leaned back, watching as the puzzle pieces clicked into place. Hale's mind raced. If Samuel Reed had been silenced, then the question wasn't just who had killed him, but who else knew, and how far they would go to keep the secret locked away. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, but the room felt colder than ever. The Ravenshire police station was a forgotten relic, a place where time seemed to move sluggishly, where the dust on the shelves held whispers of unsolved cases, and where Inspector William Graves found himself drowning in a sea of unanswered questions. He sat at his desk, staring at the only real clue he had, a torn slip of paper, smudged at the edges, with the words "Midnight, Ledger Room" scribbled in uneven ink. It was a breadcrumb, nothing more, yet something about it unsettled him. The murder of Charles Whitmore had rattled the town, but it wasn't just the crime itself that gnawed at Graves, it was the silence that followed, the peculiar absence of outrage, as if the village of Ravenshire had already decided to forget. He drummed his fingers against the desk, staring at the dimly lit corridor beyond his office, half expecting someone to appear with the missing piece he so desperately needed. Instead, it was Eleanor Wren who stepped inside, her presence quiet but commanding. Eleanor, known to most as nothing more than a retired schoolteacher, had an uncanny ability to see through people in ways Graves never could. She had lived in Ravenshire long enough to know its hidden currents, the old feuds buried under pleasantries, the secrets that festered behind lace-curtained windows. "You look troubled, Inspector," she said, lowering herself into the chair across from him, her sharp eyes flickering to the scrap of paper in his hands. "Is it the case or something more?" Graves exhaled, pushing the paper toward her. "Both," he admitted. "Something doesn't fit. Whitmore's murder should have caused an uproar, but instead, everyone seems eager to pretend it never happened." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "And then there's this Midnight Ledger Room. It sounds like a meeting, doesn't it? A planned one." Eleanor picked up the paper, tilting it toward the light. Her expression didn't change, but Graves saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes. "There was a fire at the Ravenshire mill decades ago," she murmured. "A scandal swept under the rug. The official report said it was an accident, but some believed it was deliberate, arson to cover something up. And the ledger room, that's where the records were kept before they vanished." Graves sat up straighter. "Are you saying Whitmore was looking into the past, that he found something he wasn't supposed to?" Eleanor's gaze held his, unwavering. "I'm saying," she said slowly, "that the past is never truly buried, and sometimes those who dig too deep don't live long enough to tell the tale." A chill crept down Graves' spine, but before he could respond, there was a sudden knock at the door. He exchanged a look with Eleanor before calling, "Come in." The door creaked open, and standing there pale and hesitant, was Margaret Finch, the mill's old bookkeeper. Her hands trembled as she clutched a tattered notebook to her chest. "Inspector," she whispered, stepping inside and shutting the door behind her. "I should have come sooner, but I was afraid. I found this hidden in the attic of the old mill. It belonged to Charles Whitmore." Graves reached for the book, flipping it open. His breath caught in his throat as he scanned the pages, accounts of missing shipments, false ledgers, names scribbled and crossed out. Whitmore had been uncovering something massive, something that had cost him his life. Eleanor leaned in slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Inspector, you do realize what this means, don't you?" Graves nodded, his grip tightening around the notebook. "Yes," he said grimly, "it means Whitmore wasn't the first to die because of this. And unless we find the truth, he won't be the last." The village of Blackwood Hollow had always carried a quiet unease, the kind that settled deep into the bones of its oldest residents, whispered in half-finished sentences over garden fences, and lingered like mist on the cobblestone streets. Eleanor Wren had lived here long enough to know that silence often spoke louder than words, and as she walked the narrow lane leading to the abandoned Willowmere estate, she felt the weight of that silence pressing against her. The murder of Harold Winslow had stirred something in the town, something old, something people had tried to forget. Whispers had crept through the village like a slow-moving fog, curling under doors and seeping into closed parlors where curtains were drawn just a little too tightly. People who had once greeted each other with ease, now spoke in hushed tones, their voices laced with something Eleanor recognized all too well: fear. But fear of what? The man had been found in his own home, slumped over his desk, A single bullet lodged in his skull. A robbery gone wrong, the police had claimed, but Eleanor had seen enough in her years to know a staged crime scene when she encountered one. And then there was the note, crumpled in his fist, written in shaking, almost frantic handwriting. North Chamber. Two simple words that had set Eleanor on a path leading straight to the rotting skeleton of Willowmere. She had spent the morning calling on those who had seen Blackwood Hollow before it became the picture of rural serenity it pretended to be. Mrs. Fenton, the widow of a former magistrate, sat wrapped in her shawl by the fire, her wrinkled hands clutching a faded photograph of Willowmere before it was left to rot. The house had been grand once, standing proudly at the edge of the village, its halls echoing with the laughter of wealthy men and their carefully concealed dealings. But its walls had long since darkened with the stains of something unspoken. The tunnels beneath the estate, Mrs. Fenton murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, they were meant for storage. But that's not all they were used for. Eleanor leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing. What else, Mrs. Fenton? A long pause, then a weary sigh. The war brought secrets, Miss Wren. Smuggling, disappearances. Some said there were things buried in those tunnels that should never have been found. The flicker of fear in the old woman's eyes told Eleanor enough. The past was closer than anyone cared to admit. And perhaps Harold Winslow had come too close to something best left undisturbed. As she left the cottage, she felt the air shift, heavy with something unseen. The village was quiet, too quiet. The Winslow case had rattled people, and not because it was an unusual crime, but because it threatened to uncover something they had all conspired, willingly or otherwise, to bury. Eleanor had spent enough time in Blackwood Hollow to know that the dead never truly rested here. They lingered in the forgotten corners of parlors, in the shadows of the great oaks lining the town square, in the eyes of those who remembered but refused to speak. And so, gripping the note in her gloved hand, she made her way to the place that had been calling to her ever since Winslow's murder. The estate stood skeletal against the evening sky, its windows gaping like hollowed-out eyes. Pushing open the rusted gate, Eleanor stepped inside, her footsteps swallowed by the overgrown garden. The house had been abandoned for decades, but the door creaked open far too easily, as if someone had been here recently. The smell of damp wood and decay filled her lungs as she moved cautiously through the corridors, her fingers trailing along the dust-laden walls. Something was off. Despite the layers of dust, she could see faint impressions in the floor, a footprint, slightly smudged but fresh enough to unsettle her. She wasn't the only one drawn to this place tonight. Then she saw it, a faint disturbance in the floorboards near the hearth. She knelt, pressing her palm against the wood, and felt the hollow give beneath her touch. A hidden compartment, heart-pounding, she pried it open, revealing a bundle of documents wrapped in aged cloth. As she unwrapped them, her breath caught. Names, dates, records of transactions, proof of something long buried. Some pages were water-damaged, the ink smeared beyond recognition, but others were perfectly preserved. And then in the very last document, she found Winslow's name. Her stomach tightened. He had found this before her, and he had died for it. A movement in the shadows made her still. She wasn't alone. The air turned electric as she rose slowly, turning toward the darkness. "You've come a long way, Miss Wren," a voice murmured, smooth and knowing. A figure stepped into the dim light, his presence unsettlingly calm. Tall, dressed in a dark coat, his hands tucked into his pockets, as if this were a casual meeting, rather than a confrontation in the ruins of a forgotten estate. "But I'm afraid the past doesn't like to be disturbed." Eleanor's grip tightened on the papers. "That's the trouble with the past," she said, her voice steady. "It has a way of catching up with those who try to outrun it." The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threats. The truth was within her grasp, but so was the danger it carried. And in Blackwood Hollow, secrets had always had a way of claiming those who dared to uncover them.